Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Perspective Philosophy, where we try to better our perceptions of the world through philosophical discussion. Today's episode will be me being dispatched with alacrity by Synd. So yeah, that's what's going down. He debated destiny, and we're going to be talking about the ethics of possibility or possibilities and the maximization of it, as that is his fundamental axiom, whatever that means. So we're going to get into it. We're going to get into the discussion, and I'm going to call Synd in a second. So I hope you're all ready for this one, because I certainly am. Or maybe I shouldn't be, because then I would have an increased amount of possibilities of how this, of a very amount of readiness that I could be. I don't know. Let's find out. Okay.
Hello there.
Fucking hell. Excuse me. I'm just going to turn you down. Speak there.
All right then.
Okay, sorry about that. You came through way louder than I was expecting. Right, just speak again, just so I can get you normalized.
I will dispatch your arguments with alacrity. Is that better?
That is way better, but I'm going to turn you up a tad. Right, that should be you.
All right then.
Okay, right. So I give a brief introduction of what's going on, but would you like to introduce you and your philosophical position?
Yes. So I am Synd, and I have created a new philosophy. It is a philosophy where there's one axiom, and the goal is to preserve and expand possibilities. A possibility defined as something that can happen, of which there is empirical evidence for. It is a moral system in this context.
Can I ask why it's empirical and not rational? Since that kind of it goes against necessarily modality. You could have something that's possible rationally, but not possible, physically, empirically. So why are you choosing physical possibility or empirical possibility over sheer rational possibility modality?
Because it's much more difficult to expand a possibility that is rational or something like that, because there are a lot more rational possibilities than empirical possibilities.
But if there's more of them,
so in order to simplify the calculations to analyze situations more easily, the goal is just to expand empirical possibilities.
Right. But then, why should we analyze things more? Is there a reason that we'll want that ease? What's that ease do?
Yes, there is, because it becomes much more difficult if you attempt to do it the way that you're describing with rational possibilities.
Okay, and difficulty is bad.
Well, yes, because when you're analyzing a situation, you need to be able to eliminate variables that don't matter. You need to be able to abstract them away. So when you just have rational possibilities, a rational possibility can be so many more things, but if you're trying to preserve or expand them, you need to focus on empirical possibilities. For example, if you're I've given this example before, but if you're in a white room and the only choice you can make is whether or not to smash a ladybug, you don't really need to consider anything else other than what changes as a result of the action, which is largely empirical in everyday life.
I know, but in that scenario, you not only have the option to obviously, kill the ladybug, but you have the option to think about killing the ladybug and also to think about thinking about killing the ladybug. So,
Actually, no. The purpose of that scenario was to illustrate it in very simple terms. So, no, the only thing you could do was whether or not to kill it. That was the only thing you could do. So that hypothetical is very, very restrictive, but that was just to illustrate the point.
That's fair enough.
So, you can't do those things.
It's very, that's a very defined hypothetical. That's fair enough. Between action and inaction in a given empirical scenario. But what I'm trying to work out is whether we need to enter that empirical scenario in the first place, and how we define that scenario. So I would argue that the empirical scenario in the first place is defined by the individual's approach to it, which is rational. So could the individual not redefine the scenario, and rather than seeing themselves as perhaps, smashing or non-smashing the ladybug, if they use different concepts, then the scenario could be even empirically different. So I'm just wondering why we're limiting possibility to, this empirical domain. What is the good and the bad of limiting it to the physical and not to the purely rational?
Well, first of all, I'm not entirely certain of what you mean when you say that it's rational. Like, would you give an example of a rational possibility in that scenario? Just one.
Yeah,
I think
like
that would
how we
be.
define what a ladybug is.
Oh well, yeah. The whole entire point is that it's empirical. In fact, the reason why is for that very reason is because your definitions need to be precise. Because in order to make the best decision possible, you need to be as precise as you can as you can be.
And the best decision, and what would be the best decision?
The one that preserves the most amount of possibilities,
Okay,
as
but
in
then does not.
destroys the least.
Oh, I see. But does the limitation to the empirical not destroy more possibilities because essentially it prevents the rational possibilities from being applied?
Well, here's the thing with that. It actually doesn't matter how you think of the situation in that sense, because the only thing that matters is, in a sense, the consequences, what changes as a result of the situation that is observable. So the way that you conceptualize it in your own mind in order to make the decision actually doesn't really matter in that sense.
But I mean, do you not agree that the observable, the observations that were characterized in reality are directly linked to the concepts that were placed upon it? So, for example, if you have knowledge of physics, you could see an observable reality which is related to physics. So, like, if you see an explosion, you might understand that in terms of things like like I don't know if it's like a nuclear explosion, like in terms of the half-life of the uranium, and there's all of this analysis that is made available to you. You can scientifically analyze it. Or if you're approaching it from like an artistic way, you could see it as the possibilities of like how to depict a dystopian world, or and all of this is made possible depending upon the concepts that you apply to the situation. So in saying that the empirical and the amount of possibilities that are, like, I would say that the empirical possibilities are only applied once we've conceived of a world which is empirical in the first place. So the rational always precedes the empirical.
Well, what is your point in stating that?
That the limitation of certain possibilities in this case would need to be justified prior to your meta-ethic.
Well, what do you mean by justified? Could you define
so,
what you mean? But like, could you give an example of how the way I've defined it excludes things? Because the ones that you listed all have empirical consequences.
Yeah, they may have empirical consequences, but then we need to define which. So, like, look at it like this. Like, for me to even consider that empirical consequences are valuable, I've already had to apply a certain meta-ethic to that, which would be the valuation of empirical consequences. But if I have the choice between valuing empirical consequences and rational consequences, like any my ability to conceive and create a new series of actions which is intelligible to any given agent, essentially like absolute modality or something, then that could be limited by empirical consequences. So I'm wondering why we're choosing to endorse the empirical and not the purely rational in this case, just on terms of possibility. I mean, I disagree with all of this necessarily, but it's just interesting.
Because it just makes it easier to understand. Because again, like I said, all the things that you just mentioned, the things that are limited, they all have empirical consequences, and those are possibilities by definition.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
so
I agree.
Those actually are considered. It may not seem like it from your point of view.
But what about non-empirical consequences? So for example, like you could have consequences which relate purely to my ability to conceive of something else. So if
your ability to conceive is ultimately empirically derived, your cognition.
But why do you think my cognition's empirically derived?
Well, first of all, would you define cognition? I think we may be talking about slightly different things.
How would you? Well, actually, how would I define cognition? That's actually a really important question. One second, let's see. I'm actually going to go and see what Google tells us. This mental act. Yeah, a mental act. Yeah, acquiring knowledge and understanding. So, mental action, like mental consideration of possibilities.
Yeah, it isn't a problem then, because ultimately those consequences are empirical. If you exclude certain modes of thought, or other things,
only if we apply physical modes of thought or empirical modes of thought. But I mean, there are other philosophical traditions that would explain it in different ways. Rationalism, for example. So why are we implying empiricism and not rationalism?
Yes, but ultimately the application of any system is empirical.
But how would you be able to say that if you haven't already implied the empirical? So you've applied the empirical, and so you're assuming that the outcome is always empirical. But if I was to apply the rational, the outcome would be rational. So what we have to do prior to this, conversation is work out whether we should be applying an empiricist or rationalist framework.
I actually don't grant you that needs to be done. Why? What is your basis for asserting this?
Because without as such, we would not know whether we are limiting or increasing possibilities to a greater or lesser extent. We need to work out whether possibilities are greater in the empirical, greater in the rational, or greater somewhere in between.
Well, wait a second. So my goal so earlier you asked me why I made the goal just empirical possibilities. But now the question seems to be more we need to agree on it. But for my system's purposes, that is what I made the goal. And I made it for that reason. It is ultimately arbitrary, but I don't dispute that. So
all right. So like the system's purposes, what actually is that? You say it's just ultimately arbitrary.
Yes. And that's not a problem because ultimately the things that we're talking about have fundamentally subjective components. So it doesn't really make sense for me to
it's fundamental.
Grounded in some metaphysical cosmological justification. It just doesn't really make sense because you don't need to do that.
Well, one, yes, you do. Otherwise,
Why?
I'm just going to say that.
How do you know that I need to do that?
Well, how do I know that you need to do that? Because otherwise, we would be making an assumption that what is true justified belief is actually, is actually contained within this axiomatic system. So, like,
How do you know that?
Well, how do I know?
How does that follow, though?
Well, I think that there are certain assumptions that we necessarily must make, and that would be rational assumptions.
Could you name one?
Like logic.
Well, logic is descriptive, so it's not really an assumption.
I wouldn't say it's descriptive. I'd say that necessarily. I would say it's actually signification itself. So I wouldn't say that logic describes reality more than it aids us in conceiving of it in the first place. Like logic.
Can you define signification?
The ability to represent something real.
How is that separate from description?
Because I would say that I would have thought of maybe this might be just personal, but I would have thought of a description as giving like what would I say? It would be maybe like factual or One second. I'm trying to think of how I actually would describe description itself. That didn't help at all. Like, yeah, so I would have probably said that it would be to give meaning. That's probably actually where I would say. I'd be like, descriptions, I think, I would argue, usually require definitions. But to nominally signify can be ostensive and non-meaningful, like just to essentially label something without giving it determinate being, nominal.
What does that mean exactly? It appears you've just engaged in adding additional layers of abstraction. Think of it
like it's like this is that's what I would say. Like it's
why is
like
this
one
necessary?
Is more. It's not. I would say it's not necessary. What? Why is logic necessary, or why is I would say that this level of abstraction is necessary, or conception is necessary in order to form language, and then language allows for description, and description allows for prescription, which is kind of necessary for this whole field of ethics from which we're engaged in. But like, yeah, I would just say that the signification of the world is just a necessary formulation for which we can engage in logical thinking. And
I just don't see how you demonstrate
I would even
that
say
your definition of logic is any...
And actually, I would go...
I just don't see how you've justified how logic is anything other than descriptive.
Well, I'm not saying that I'm not saying that logic's necessarily descriptive. I'm saying it's indubitable. That's how I describe logic. Logic doesn't necessarily describe anything. It gives us the conditions for something to exist in the first place. It's a priori and it's transcendental.
How is it transcendental?
Because it's necessary.
Could you give an example of transcendental logic in a sense? Can you give an example of that?
Okay, so like something. So for the possibility of mathematics to exist, there needs to be something like numbers to represent numerical figures. So
You think that mathematics exists in a way? Please forgive me. I
yeah,
am
I do.
notorious for doing this. But could you define exist?
How would I define exist? Okay, how would I define exist? That's actually a very existential question. um, I guess I would say to have some form of reality, but I think that, to be, I don't know, to be, how would I define exist? Heidegger basically just says to be here, so that doesn't really help. To be experiential, to be experienced.
So
or at least perceivable.
Mathematics exists because it can be experienced, but the thing is that when you even describe mathematics as an it, you're already implying that it exists in a sense. So
I think that we would. I think that there depends on the problem is with this question when you talk about. I mean, I'm not going to get into mathematical realism because that's just a whole fucking can of worms. But essentially, you can approach mathematics in a way in which the system itself is not abstracted from reality, but exists as a form of equipment for an individual to use, a technology, and it would still exist. And that's the point I was making. Mathematics is a form of equipment.
I reject that
as is
way
language.
Of perceiving it. So I'm just wondering what the utility of doing that is.
What the utility of doing that is.
Why
the
would
analysis
you
of the structure.
So that more simply just as a descriptive system that doesn't necessarily exist in the sense that it can be experienced just like a touch can be experienced.
I can give an example of that. So I think that this allows for the existential analysis of the structure itself, which allows us to divest more and more meanings, which allows us to see more and more the possibilities that could exist if we were to apply different axioms, and so allows us to construct new and different mathematical systems. And this allows for the debates between mathematical realism, like formalism and intuitionism, logicism. Without it, we wouldn't have had, obviously, Principia Mathematica, Bertrand Russell. We wouldn't have had, Frege. We wouldn't have had Gödel and all of this. All of this has come from the analysis of the structure of mathematics, which had to be understood as a form of equipment which is malleable to the human mind in the first place, and essentially allows us to pursue a certain goal, which is defined differently depending upon how you understand the field. So yeah.
But you don't necessarily need to view it that way in order to make more innovations with mathematics. I mean, you just haven't demonstrated that it's necessary in order to view it that way.
I'd have said that it was. How is it I would say that it's separate. I would say that in terms of necessary to view it that way, no, it's not necessary to view it that way. But in terms of how it functions, I would say it necessarily functions as a signifier. You don't necessarily have to view anything anyway. I mean, you could poke your eyes out and live in the dark. I mean, it depends upon what we would say was necessary in the first place. And I would say, if you could build it up and say that it was sufficient, we should sufficiently, we ought to view it that way. I could make an argument saying why we ought to view things in an existential way, if you would prefer.
Well, here's the thing. It's just you're engaging additional layers of abstraction because you're describing mental processes. But my point is that when you do this and try to establish some sort of structure, some sort of meaning analogous to, say, mathematics exists in a way that an apple that you can touch in physical reality exists, if anything, it kind of biases your modes of thought.
Well, I have to say that it exists in the same way. I mean, modes of existence. You could say that there is a physical existence and non-physical existence, like material and immaterial existence. There's no reason to limit existence to the material necessarily, is there?
Could you please repeat?
Is there a reason that we must limit that which exists to the physical?
Well, in a sense, yes, it does make it easier because all of the mental processes we've discussed so far, when you try to systemize and formalize them the ways that you were describing, you're actually just biasing yourself to only examine certain things. So even though your intent is to consider more things, when you formalize fundamentally structures that are not observable. You're actually just saying what can and can't be when you haven't even
Yeah, but that
considered
is the
what
exact
being.
critique. That is the exact critique that I gave your empiricist position. So I said that
Yes, but
seeing it. So
that's the
it's
critique that I
yeah.
levy
So it's a
at your
burden.
position
It's
as
a
well.
burden of proof that we both must bear. So why choose empiricism over rationalism or any other form of conception? So like I'm asking you why this axiom. Like why necessarily should we choose empirical possibility and not rational possibility, given your axiom rather?
Because the goal of my system is to analyze possibilities that are empirical. So that's just the goal of my system. And when you use it practically, it has practical effects as well. So that's why.
Okay,
A
so
large reason why. And
one.
also, I
So
just like to wonder,
did you gain
what
the,
is your
wait, just out of curiosity, just did you gain that goal of your system empirically?
what do you mean by empirically?
Like, so empirical possibilities, all that matters, yeah?
Well, first of all, what do you mean by matters? It's
Like,
not really.
all that is, what is it? Anything which maximizes possibilities is what you consider, okay? And then you've limited that to empirical possibilities. And I'm just wondering, would your system, I'm asking if your system lives up to its own standard. Does it maximize possibilities in its existence?
Well, you would actually need empirical evidence to see if the goal actually works in reality. So that's one of the reasons why I'm actually talking about it. Because when I see people use it and I look at comments in the feedback that I get, I'm trying to see how it works when people ingest it and understand it. So, in fact, it's undergone several revisions because of this. For example, my definition of possibilities used to be observable descriptants and vectors of change. And this used to be much broader in a sense. I used to have a 4-part meta definition, which I can still use because it still captures my intent. But ultimately, my system's validity depends on empirical evidence. It depends on the results of applying that system. And also, I have another question for you. What is your definition of a possibility?
My definition of a possibility.
Yes.
So I would say, I would say that possibility itself would be anything which is conceivable, as the result of anything else, maybe, or
okay,
no,
so that's literally anything.
So literally anything, yeah. Well, no, literally anything which is logically possible. Rationalism, innit?
Yes, if I use that definition, that would make my system useless because you couldn't really expand any because they're all already possibilities.
Useless at doing what, man? Useless at doing what? Because it would be creating more possibilities. That's the whole point. Like, if it's all about creating possibilities, then we'll create more and more possibilities. And the more possibilities we create, the more useful your system is, since it's circular, since you state that it's axiomatic. And that's kind of me critique.
Well, no, it isn't really circular. It's only circular if I use your definition. Because your definition, anything that's conceivable as a result of something else.
It's circular in the sense that you said
will you name one thing that isn't conceivable as a result of something else?
One thing I was going to say is that the reason it's circular, the reason I was saying it was circular, is because you say at the bottom there is an axiomatic foundation from which you are essentially giving to us tautologically, this is the foundational truth from which this system, arrives. It has to be circular, right? It's an axiom, right? It's true by itself. So when I say that it's circular, like when I'm saying like it produces more possibilities, so it's better because better is more possibilities. That's not me.
Exactly. I don't deny that.
Then why are you limited to the empirical?
Because if I were to use your definition, you couldn't really expand them. Because please name one thing that isn't conceivable as a result of something else.
One thing
that's your definition.
Do we accept, like, it depends on whether we accept, like, okay, I'm not gonna lie, it gets pretty complex. So isn't conceivable by anything else. So it depends. If we accept that Kant's defeated Hume's problem of induction, then,
I don't accept that. So I reject that premise.
Okay, you reject that. So anything is possible. Anything could be caused by anything else. That's like the Humean position, right? So possibility is in itself a relationship between ideas, and relationship between ideas is anything which is logically conceivable. So anything which could be logically conceived in relationships with the ideas is like possibility. So anything which is rationally conceivable would not be,
yes,
you
I'd
know,
like you to give
itself
an example
and
of
not
something
itself.
that isn't
All right,
by that
okay,
definition.
okay. P and not P. A square triangle. Like, I don't know. Try and think of anything else. You know, you're getting the drift.
Well, actually, you can still conceive of a square triangle. For example, I could say, as a result of saying blah, a square triangle will appear.
That's not a
How is
conception.
that not a possibility? Because I conceived of it.
You haven't
I conceived of it as being a result of something else.
You haven't conceived of it because you can't give any content. You've nominally named.
Well, how do you determine what is conceived and what isn't conceived?
Something which has definable characteristics, like has
the definable characteristics. Well, there are certain undefinable characteristics of a square triangle, obviously, but I can still think of it even though I have no means of actually describe, because I just described it. So I just said square triangle.
See, I would disagree. I would say definitionally you can't think of it, and I would say that
well,
because
I just said I thought of a square triangle.
You say you did, but you didn't. Like, because of the.
Well, how do you know that? You have no means of demonstrating.
Oh, I do
that.
because of the words that you used. Square and triangular are defined as mutually separate and different, and so they cannot be both themselves and not themselves simultaneously, and therefore are impossible logically. So it cannot be thought of.
But here's the thing that you've done there. I'd like to point this out. When you say that certain things like that are not logically possible, for example, you are actually biasing yourself to not considering concepts that are close to them. Or for example, say there's a square, but it looks like that it's a triangle because of an optical illusion.
Okay, so you're saying,
and say a square triangle is actually the best way to describe it.
Wait, but so you're saying that like a square
You're just
kind
biasing
of
yourself to
a
not
square kind of triangle, but then it would never be a triangle or a square. So you'd be saying it has properties of both, but it's neither.
Yes, that's exactly my point. You were just all you're doing in engaging in these additional layers of abstraction. It probably needs a new word. You're just biasing your thinking.
No, not really. It just means I'm limiting myself to certain concepts. If anything, I would say, like, if you take this approach, then what you're going to find is at the bottom of all of this is going to be Brahman, where all existential possibilities remain, quote unquote possible, because we never actually engage in conceptualization. And this would probably be the end of something like a Sartrean understanding of existentialism.
That's why I don't use your definition.
No, I mean, if anything, this fits your system way better. Like, we should just stop. If anything, we should stop conceiving of things and just start naming things differently over and over again for all eternity.
By using your definition of possibility. That's why.
Well, I mean, there is the argument that if I wouldn't be able to come to that conclusion, and I think this is kind of the knockdown argument. I wouldn't be able to come to that conclusion without language, and if I didn't give myself over to this language, then I wouldn't be able to conceive of the outcome. And so I have to conceive of at least one rational. Like, I need some level of conceptualization for us to have any possibility whatsoever. So I think that would be the thing. So we need to obviously engage in some sort of rational system, and some mode of thought, so some linguistic structure. And so, like, you're saying I'm biasing myself. I'm saying I can't help but biasing myself. And then you say, all right, well, you do realize that if we went with this mode of thought, that if you didn't bias yourself, you'd have more possibilities if you didn't have language. And I'm like, well, yeah, except the argument itself relies upon the limitation of possibilities to even function. So arguably, you could say that your axiom leads to its own destruction and absurdity.
Well, again, you haven't really demonstrated why I require a greater definition.
What?
You haven't really demonstrated that. You've just said what can happen if you think of it as a certain way.
That's basically what's possible, but you consider possibility itself as being the end goal. So,
yes, expanded empirical possibilities. For example, when you create new technology, there is now empirical evidence of something that can be done, of which there was no empirical evidence beforehand. That is one of the goals of my system.
I'm asking why we care about...
That's one of the byproducts of my system, is that when you seek to expand possibilities, you use whatever methods you can in order to reach that goal. So it would so if people adopted that as my goal, there's empirical evidence that would increase, say, innovation or other things, because their goal in life is to expand the amount of possibilities of which are empirical evidence for.
Okay, so we'll move past rationalism versus empiricism for now, because I think that's not something that we're necessarily gonna. We're just gonna keep empiricism as just like it's part of the axiom. It's empirical possibilities. It's not written in the axiom. That's all that matters. Okay.
Yeah, but here's the thing, though. When you describe the greater school of empiricism and say that my system necessarily subscribes to that, it's not really, because you can take anything that you want and make a system that you want as long as it has clearly defined bounds and functions. So when you say that I subscribe to empiricism, that comes with additional theoretical baggage that I haven't necessarily accepted or assumed.
Well, I mean, so it kind of does. That's the issue, man. Like, you can't just say, I've accepted empiricism, except I'm not really accepting empiricism because it might, you know...
Well, it's not accepting empiricism when I decide to narrow the bounds of my definition.
Okay, so
that's not accepting empiricism. That's just using possibilities.
If there's an axiom, there is... The axiom as the foundation has to be somewhat unchanging or, like, definable. Otherwise, it will lead to absurdity. In which case... anything is possible in this system. So that's kind of the reason that mathematicians take an axiom in the first place, as to define the limitations of reason and the application of reason in the first place, so that we can actually have some sort of notion of possibility, even in this way.
That's exactly what I've done. The notion is that...
So then you're going to have to take the baggage with it, man. You can't...
possibilities of which there is empirical evidence for.
So you got to take the baggage.
You can identify empirical evidence by observation.
You can't just define so let's say if you said like empirical, like empiricist, and take empirical evidence. You're going to get the baggage of empirical evidence, man. So when I start saying to you, when you look at an object, and you empirically, gain information from that object, are you in direct relation to that object? And does the possibility of the object not actually exist in the interpretation of the object within your mind? And in which case, how can you ever say that you're actually empirically verifying anything? And I'm going to take that Berkeleyan route. How are you going to then argue against that?
Will you please repeat?
So for example, there was a guy, I think it was 18th century? Or was it 17th century? I have to double check. Bishop George Berkeley. Actually, most people know him as the guy who said, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? Right. And the reason he said that is essentially he basically points out, well, sound is something you hear. It's something which is being observed. If we accept the British empiricist tradition, and we accept that all knowledge is abstracted from a reality which we observe, then what we end up accepting is that we aren't in direct relation to reality. We perceive it through sense organs. And if we perceive it through sense organs, then the interpretation of reality actually occurs within our brain, which means that we never actually experience reality and only an interpretation of reality. So empirical evidence is never actually physical. It's always immaterial. In which case, depending on how we interpret this evidence and how we interpret the world depends on how the world actually forms to us. So why should I interpret the world in one way and not in another?
Well, you haven't. Well, first of all, you look at my system and what the goal is, and you look at the results of that goal. So it really is self-contained. You don't really need to appeal to what you're appealing to. For example, why should I accept the presuppositions and assumptions of the schools of thought that you've just said when all I say is empirical evidence? Now, the only point of contention in that is that what it does or does not constitute empirical evidence. But the reason why I don't really bother with that is because that's largely a procedural question. But you're not really saying based off
how is it procedural? How is it it's not just a largely look at it like this. Like what evidence is, if you're saying that evidence is essentially so for example, all possibility is defined by empirical evidence, but then you won't define what empirical evidence is, then
empirical evidence is evidence that is observed.
It's evidence that's observed.
There are definitions do differ. Some include replicability, others don't. But empirical evidence is by definition testable.
Okay.
So if you can test for it, then
testable. So that means it needs to be verified. It needs to be falsifiable, would you say, or free? And would you say that knowledge is possible in this, like true justified belief, free of relevant falsehood, we put the Gettier clause
What
in.
do you mean by true justified belief? I actually don't really need a truth claim for my system to function, because ultimately the purpose of my system is to be practical. It's supposed to give a goal that you can strive for.
Okay, so you don't think
it
so?
doesn't really,
Well, you can have a goal that you can strive for without empirical evidence, or without anything actually, really beyond
yeah, but that's
the
not
logical.
what my system is. The
Okay,
goal is.
but then why you?
strictly-
But like, what's confusing me is like you're saying like, okay, so as long as it functions, that's okay. So an individual could be both right or wrong in a situation, and that would not matter.
No, because there's empirical.
So the reality,
for
so
it. It's
so
testable.
so it doesn't matter whether someone smashes a ladybug or not, then yeah.
Yes, it does, because if you smash the ladybug, there's empirical evidence that you've decreased possibilities.
But there's no truth. There's no
because-
truth criteria. There's no criterion of truth or knowledge. So how would you know that?
Well, actually, no, you haven't demonstrated the need for a criterion of truth. What is the need for a conceptualization of truth in the sense? Would you be willing to define truth?
Would I be willing to?
Because you haven't demonstrated why I need such a criterion. It's an
um,
additional layer of abstraction that isn't necessary.
Okay, I'd say truth would be the accurate conception of reality, where you understand reality as it is.
Well, will you define reality? Because you did have trouble defining existence.
That which we're
earlier, so
experiencing. That which we're experiencing.
Okay, so reality is that which we are experiencing.
Uh-huh.
And you just said that truth is an accurate description of that which we are experiencing.
Yes.
Would you be willing to define experience then? Because isn't experience ultimately empirical?
Non-definable.
Oh, so if experience is non-definable, then how is what you've said anything?
Well, this is actually, funnily enough, this is actually explained by Zizek, Lacan, and Hegel. So essentially, what we construct as was that the truth is structured like a fiction. So the reality of the situation is reality is that which we experience. It's infinite and it goes beyond human conception in its infiniteness. And the only way that we can conceive of it and engage in reality or engage in any possibilities of reality and conceive of any notion of reality is to essentially destroy what reality is and construct a fiction so that we can engage with reality. This is what's essentially what we do with ideology. And so
it still relies on unsubstantiated assumptions. I reject those because you can't demonstrate it. Also, please forgive me for interrupting, but did you state that experience was undefinable?
I said that experience in its totality and its infiniteness is undefinable. Well, or at least
can you just define the word experience?
Actually, I'm not going to lie if it's undefinable, because I'm a little bit contentious of whether Hegel's right or not in terms of absolute spirit leading to perfect knowledge in a one-to-one relationship with reality, where we see it as it is. So it's kind of like,
if experience is undefinable,
it's kind of difficult for us. I'm not going to lie.
And if you define truth is that which we accurately experience, you just said that which we can accurately undefinable. That means nothing.
Wait. Sorry, say that again. I didn't know.
If experience is undefinable, and if truth is that which we can accurately undefinable, because experience isn't definable.
Well, it's
you haven't stated anything.
I probably should have been more clear. It's not that experience isn't definable. I mean, in its
will
infinite.
You define it then?
Oh, well, I think that we define it.
Well,
okay, I'll define it right now. I'm looking at a camera. This is a laptop. I'm touching a table. I feel quite warm. Like these are all adequate definitions of experience.
Those are empirically observable Those are examples of experience. That isn't a definition of experience. Which this is the thing.
This is the thing. Experience is any possible definition from which could be applied to one's existence, or to existence rather.
Okay, and you said earlier that existence. What was your definition for existence again?
What the fucking hell? What was my definition? I should be writing this down. I would that which is like, honestly, I think Heidegger says it best when he just says being here.
Wait, isn't that experience? So your definition of existence is experience, but your definition of experience is existence.
Yeah, I'm an existentialist.
I reject that.
I would say that the separation between, like, this is where Heidegger basically says, like, essentially, our conceptions of reality are based off our existence, and our existence allows for our experience, and our experience is all in total only a description of our existence. All there is existence.
Okay, well, all of the things that you just listed for experience, those are all observable.
Well, yes, I mean,
Exactly, which
so,
is one of the reasons why
but
possibilities are empirical.
Well, I mean,
in order to
empirical
set the
separate
bounds.
necessarily from observable. I think usually
every single example of experience you listed, all of those were observable.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. What do you mean? Do you just take empirical to mean purely observable? So so for example, if
could you list an experience that you think I think I have an idea? Could you give an example of an experience that you think my system doesn't apply to?
What, an experience
based on my definition of possibility?
Well, I mean, I give the rational examples and the phenomenal examples.
How are those rational examples? You listed warmth,
rationalist,
touching. Those are all observable.
Rationalists, rationalist examples. So you could have the experience of performing, let's say, mathematical analysis or something.
That still ultimately has empirical characteristics.
You're defining empirical.
We have empirical evidence.
Honestly, I think you're defining empirical as existential, that which is or experiential. You're not defining empirical as that which is, so for example, if you're saying testable, which is what you were saying before, is my experience of inner thought testable?
Actually, we are making progress on that front. For example, there was one study that found that you could, using new technology, we could actually map people's dreams so you could see images of what they were thinking about.
And why should we assume that our perception is of their inner, so this is the hard problem of consciousness. If I'm perceiving their dreams in my,
it's what you'd expect to see if we could do that. It's not an assumption perspective.
So no, but it's if I'm perceiving someone's dream, am I experiencing their dream, or am I perceiving my conception of their dream?
Well, perspective, that's ultimately a non-issue. It really is because all you're doing is you're just failing to distinguish between whatever your abstract conceptualization of something is and what something actually is empirically. So it's a problem of distinction.
I thought you said that. Wait a minute, actually. What do you mean by actual? What's actual? What's actual?
When did I say actual?
You said what actually is rather than...
I meant an abstract. I just meant the abstract concept, just a thought. When you say that, you aren't distinguishing it between the evidence for a dream and what a dream really is. So, and by the way, is the evidence don't have
So the evidence for a dream versus what a dream really is. So you would say, so this is the
point is that you haven't demonstrated
the
need for the concepts that you're describing. You keep referencing various schools of thought of philosophy, but they're all very abstract and they all suffer from not being able to distinguish between phenomena.
Well, they actually, what do you mean they don't distinguish between phenomena?
Because when I said that there's evidence that you can see images of the images that someone else is thinking about, that was what the study was about, that there really isn't an issue there because there's just evidence that we can do that. It's what you'd expect to see if we could.
What do you mean by evidence?
Look at people.
What do you mean by evidence?
Empirical evidence.
And what do you mean by empirical evidence?
Evidence is anything that would say, I'm a bit fuzzy on my definition of evidence, but generally evidence is something that would increase the probability of something being true or just be something, a characteristic of something. For example,
wait a minute. So evidence is...
If we could
let's just write this
people's
down.
dreams.
So evidence is probability. Was it increased probability of something being real?
Yes, roughly. I need to give an example so we can better grasp it. So
okay.
If we could, let's assume that we could see people's dreams, as in you could see the mental image that someone else is seeing when they're thinking about something. Empirical evidence of that would be, say, the study that I cited, because if we could do that, you'd expect to see empirically that the image that we're looking at on the monitor corresponds to the image that the person is seeing in their mind. There are certain aspects of that aren't verifiable, but that's still empirical evidence that we can do that because it is what you'd expect to see if we could.
No, wait a minute. So it is what I would expect to see if we could. And why would I have that expectation?
because it's part of the description of what that is.
Okay,
being
and is
able
that
to look at the
description?
same
Did you
images
get
as
that?
people are conceiving of in their minds.
And did you get that
It's
description?
part of the description. It's ultimately
Right.
rooted in
And-
definitions,
and
all of which
just
correspond
wondering,
to reality.
Did we get that description from something empirical?
Yes, we did.
We did. How did we get it?
What do you mean? How did we get it?
Like how did
It's
we
like
get?
saying
How
if
did
you
how did
look
we
at
get?
an apple?
Like
This
how,
is my definition
yeah,
of an apple.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
How
supposed
did
to correspond to.
Like yeah, but how? Was it
What do
empirically?
you mean by
Was it
how? Anyway, as I was saying,
Well,
say you have an
what-
apple on a table. Say we're both in a white room, perspective and Synd. And say we're looking at a table with an apple on it. And I say, this is an apple. This is my definition of an apple. And say we've never seen anything else. Let's just say we're in a white room. No one else is there. We're just saying,
So
okay,
ostensibly,
I define an apple as this. And you list all of the observable characteristics of the apple. You list its location in time, or whatever you're talking about. You list every single characteristic possible of that apple. And your definition, when you say that definition of that apple, it's supposed to correspond to what is empirically, what is observed
So
empirically.
I think that before we continue, just to clear, with the apple, when I say this is an apple, what am I referencing when I do that?
It depends on what your definition is.
It depends on what my definition is.
Yes.
So if my definition is, I would actually agree with you, by the way, on that. But I want to see whether you agree with me. So, okay. So if I'm like I don't know, like this is a bottle of hand sanitizer, right? Okay, that I'm holding right here, right? And I define hand sanitizer as this, right?
Yes.
Yes. And then what if you said, that's not a bottle of hand sanitizer, that's a bottle of antibacterial hand gel, right?
Then, well, depending on your definition of hand sanitizer, obviously definitions have to be described in words. The words ultimately point to aspects of reality.
Do they?
And yes, they do.
In
fact, did you know that the and is don't actually have definitions? The is just used to point to other words.
Well, it's like this and that.
Is,
it's like this and that. It's like this and that as well. Like, so this, that, here,
exactly.
Now.
So more complicated words, they just point to different aspects of reality. And
but reality, really what's problem. That? What's reality?
Well, first of all, by reality, I just largely mean observable reality. Just observe that which can be observed.
Something that can be observed or is being observed.
The distinction actually isn't that relevant, actually, because
reality?
You can't really make any proclamations about what can be observed if you don't have any empirical evidence for that.
So I need empirical wait a minute. So I need empirical evidence so that I can have empirical evidence, because empirical evidence, as you've said, relates to reality. So yes, I need empirical evidence when you say, in order to discover whether I can have empirical evidence.
Yes, but here's the thing. When you say empirical evidence, this is largely a problem of categorization. When you say empirical evidence, you're describing so many different things. So it isn't necessarily circular when you say that you need empirical evidence for empirical evidence, because ultimately you're describing different things. So if you use one thing,
and how do you know that's different? Do you get empirical evidence for that? And how do you know that they're different? Do I get empirical evidence for that?
What are you saying? What do you mean? How do you know that they're different?
So, like, if empirical evidence, so if it's non-tautological, but you're saying we need empirical evidence to get empirical evidence, or non-circular rather, if we need empirical evidence to get empirical evidence, and I need to be able to distinguish between empirical evidence 1 and empirical evidence 2, how ought I do that? What allows me to distinguish between those two, what's the word that would be appropriate for the Frege-Geaching Bedden problem? Those two, let's say, objects or terms, those two notions. There we go. What lets
empirical evidence 1, for example, refers to an apple, and empirical evidence 2 refers to hand sanitizer.
We're not referring to
Can you not distinguish between the two?
Well, this is the thing. That's particular forms of empirical evidence. But if we say
that's
empirical evidence
itself,
is generalizable
in the same sense
empirical evidence itself,
perspective. Empirical evidence isn't generalizable in the sense that your other philosophical concepts are.
Empirical
Because
evidence is
ultimately, when you're talking about empirical evidence, you're talking about something very specific.
right. So
We
it's
have the term
non-universal.
empirical evidence
So it's
can apply in a
non-universal.
broad sense because we're talking about a general phenomenon. But to say that it's circular, to say that we need empirical evidence for empirical evidence, it isn't, because you're talking about different things.
Okay, so if empirical evidence is a general phenomenon, like it's a universal, and you're saying that, and I was to say, like, you said, we have empirical evidence about reality, for a notion of reality to exist. And then I said, like, well, how do we gain that? Like, how do we get that empirical evidence? Through empirical evidence. And you said, yes, through empirical evidence. And then so what we're going to have is I have reality in this way because I have empirical evidence, which is reality, which I point towards reality for, which I gain from empirical evidence. And can you see how I'm going to, essentially it's going to be self-referential?
Yes, which isn't a problem because the definition of reality is bounded. Your definition of reality and the other ones of the other philosophers that you mentioned are useless because you basically just said that reality is everything, infinite expanse, anything.
But it's useless in relation to the self-referential game that we're playing.
Well, first of all, what is the problem with it being self-referential? Because as I said earlier, you're talking about different things when you talk about different empirical evidence. When you use empirical evidence to verify empirical evidence, you're not talking about the exact same thing. What you've done is you've taken a broad category and applied it to very specific situations of phenomena that are...
This is why I think truth matters. Because if it's self-referential, then...
You haven't demonstrated that.
No, well, I'm trying to, yeah. So let's say.
Okay.
So if it's self-referential, right? Let's say it's the world is this way because we have empirical evidence to say it's this way, and it is, and we have empirical evidence to say it's this way because the world is this way, and it keeps going like that. Now, unless we can say that there is some form of separation between, let's say, what we are referring to and the real, quote unquote, which is what I was trying to say before, that there is a reality that we are referring to. Then that's the only way we can break this self-referential point where we go, it simply is that way. It is structured that way. When I am giving like a description or empirical analysis, I am actually forming a signifier. I'm forming a concept which allows me to understand the world and conceive of it separately. I am describing the world. It is purely a one-to-one corresponding relationship, right? Now, that's what I think that you want, right?
Well, what you just described is an observable difference. You do realize that, right? A signifier is observably different than a descriptor.
We did just agree that what's observable can be dependent upon what we are describing, which is why you ended up in the self-referential hole in the first place. Because you said, like, what an apple is, and
why this self-referential
is how we define it. And I said, is it how we define it? And then you said yes. And I said, well, I agree, but kind of. So I would say that there is a fittingness, quote unquote, to the concept, that we can only apply certain concepts to apples and them actually hold truth value. And truth value being shared in experience, where we all agree that this concept is applicable to this object, where this language game is playable. It is both rational and it corresponds to our experience. Now, that, I would say, allows us to move out of something which is self-referential. So when you define apple as anything, then possibility is essentially a self-referential game. And then that's why I said, like, well, should we not end up in that game anyway? Because that would maximize the goal of your system. Why should we care about the empirical and is the empirical...
It wouldn't maximize the goal of my system because the goal is not what your goal is. The goal relies on the definition. Also, I have a quick question.
The empirical in this situation...
I have a quick question.
Okay, can I just say this one thing? Also, the empirical in this sense is being defined as something which is self-referential. It's not something which we can relate to anything. It just is. And so the point, empirical's whatever the fuck we want it to be, because the definition's whatever we want it to be. Like apple.
You just said that the observable reality is whatever we want it to be. No, it isn't actually.
But it's only testable if we say that, like, so observable and testable. Then, but let's say we define what is observable and testable. Like I'm saying, like, this is my point. I don't think we get to define words. I think that language and multiple agents are necessarily having to define words together. And then not only that, they are also having to define words in relation to a commonly held experience. And these are the definable necessary factors of any system. Yes, it does have a lot to do with truth. Because
remember what your definition of truth was, that which can be accurately experienced. That has nothing to do with
no, that was my
terms.
No, that like truth would be accurate corresponding to that which is actually experienced or experiential.
Okay, that's a little bit different than the definition than earlier. But again, that has nothing to do with mutually agreeing upon terms. It's an act of practicality when you do that. But the ambiguities that you're speaking of, you're looking at those ambiguities and you're using it to justify additional layers of abstraction that aren't justified.
But why are they not justified if it increases possibility?
And also, I have a quick question that we sort of glossed over from earlier. Why is self-referentiality a problem?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily like if we say it's self-referential and it's a problem. I mean, like, problem in the first place. It depends on what we mean by that.
No, what I mean is that you said that we need to break out of this trap. You said that earlier. How is it a trap?
Okay, so I see it as a trap because without any notion of truth, then anything is possible. If anything is possible, then essentially, then possibility is in and of itself infinite. So we don't have to worry about action or inaction, no matter what we do. It's absurdity. Welcome home.
Yeah. That's because your definition for possibility is useless. It's because you said that possibility is anything which can be conceived as a result of something else. But if you narrow it and just ground your definitions in what is observed, it may not be perfect, obviously, because what you observe may be different from someone else's due to various.
But you said that what I observe is how I define it. So how can it be both how I define it? So how can I define something? So I define something by observing it. Is that right?
What do you mean? How do you define something?
So you said like
that is
necessary. I said like with the hand sanitizer, right? You were like, I said one person defines it one way, one person defines another, and then you were like, I said, well, what's the possibilities here? And you said, well, it depends on how we define it. Same with the apple. And then I said, well, how? Then you said that you just said there that we get our definitions from the empirical, that which is observable. I'm like, okay, and we get them how? Like through observation. So we get our definitions from observation, which allows us to then observe the thing. So which happened first? Did we observe it and then get our definitions, or did we get our definitions and then observe it?
It doesn't actually matter.
Does it not?
No, it doesn't. You can make it whatever you want as long as it's consistent.
If I apply a definition which has no empirical basis and define that which is observable by it, then have I not defined the empirical, which is based off of that observation? And so empirical evidence becomes anything I want it to be.
The implications of that are the things that you're missing. What matters is the other empirical implications that are affected by such a definition.
Well, we're looking at this. I can define anything. That's the whole point of it being self-referential. I can define anything. Yes. This is absurdity.
So the entire point of this exercise is demonstrated the utility of my definition of possibilities. Because if you conceive of possibilities as anything that can happen you can conceive of as a result of something else, then it is far too broad to be of any use. Because ultimately the use of my system is to have a goal that you can identify empirically, and you can identify the results empirically.
Well, the thing is, saying the goal of your system, you're already assuming the goal of your system, right? So you're saying,
I am.
So
I haven't denied
so you're
that.
saying the goal of my system is to maximize possibilities, which means that my system is meeting the goal of my system, and it's obviously circular, which is what we agreed, right?
Yes, we do agree, but that isn't a problem.
But then I said that, well, looking at it necessarily as, let's say, I said that with this self-referential basis, we can fall into the principle of explosion, absurdity, right? And then that maximizes possibilities, but it also destroys the very concept of possibility in and of itself. Do you see the issue here?
Will you please repeat?
So
how does it lead to an explosion in a sense? You haven't really demonstrated that because, as I said earlier,
pretty sure I demonstrated it before.
Actually, I'd just like you to restate it, please. How does it lead to an explosion of which anything could be a possibility?
So you said that which is that which is experiential. So that which is observable because it's defined in that way. I observe an apple because I've defined it as an apple.
Ultimately, when you talk about something observable, it needs to be testable outside of language, obviously.
So it has to be testable outside. I would agree. There we have a notion of truth.
No,
That would
you
we
still
are
need
right.
a notion of truth.
Well,
Your notion of truth is nebulous because you said truth is anything that...
like our possibilities and what is actually defined as being right or wrong and testable relies upon whether we can gain accurate representation of reality. So it can't be self-referential and actually function.
Okay, as I just said, it needs to be testable outside of language. So you do realize that that isn't a problem then, right? That doesn't lead to an explosion if it's testable outside of language.
One, that's only just been that occurrence has only just come from what, an hour of conversation has testable outside of language and testable.
Well, wait a minute. What did you think that testable meant then?
Well, you said just observable, but then you said observation was
what I'm defining. Do you know what testable means? It was a conventional definition. I didn't have a specialized definition of testable.
Well, I'm assuming that you need multiple parties and a common experience,
is, right?
Yeah, I know. Like,
it isn't just a linguistic exercise, so you can't just say that it's anything.
But the point is that the conceptual reality from which you engage in defines how you are able to test in the first place. This is essentially the issues that are experienced if you take...
Well, the conceptual reality, actually, no, it doesn't.
Okay.
It really doesn't have to engage in that. First of all, could you define what conceptual reality
so,
as?
Like, phenomenal.
Divorce.
I would say, like, so, like, so one, I would make the argument that how we conceive of reality is what overall conditions the possibilities of reality. So... For example, 1 plus 1.
Because if you jump,
1 plus 1 equals 2 depends on how we define 1 and 1. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, like, everything in this respect has relation to the language game from which we are actually engaged upon.
No,
right?
The implications of this are false. No.
It's like what I'm saying is that the limit.
If this were the case, why don't you jump in front of a car because you can redefine it so you won't die?
Well, I think that I would agree. I think that's fucking insane. But I am not a phenomenalist, okay? And I agree that there is an outside, world from which we test, which is why I believe in the truth. But you're the one that said truth doesn't matter.
Of truth does not help you in that regard. If anything, it makes it more difficult to engage with observable.
What are you talking about? Like, is it true or not? If I jumped in front of a car, that I would die.
There's empirical evidence for that.
And what does the empirical evidence relate to?
What do you mean? What do you mean? What does it relate to? What does that mean?
So, what is evidence?
First of all, the definition for most of my definitions are largely dictionary, so I don't really have a specialized definition for evidence outside of what the scientific community currently calls it. But as we talked about earlier, definition for evidence is something that would increase the probability of something being
real.
Yes.
And if it's real, it's probably experiential, but you try to pull me up on that, but now it sounds like you're agreeing with us.
Well, here's the thing. You said that you couldn't define experience, so I don't really care about what...
Well, I said I could define experience, but only with language, and then you said, but that's only particular descriptions, and I said, well, that's all we're really going to get, unless you want to... Unless the only thing I could say other than that is the totality of possible describable experience, which is like the phenomena, right? That's basically what I said, right?
Could you please restate?
So, like, okay, sorry. Right. So, if look at it like this. Like, that which I'm experiencing is only conceivable in terms of if I apply a limit.
Okay, please forgive me for interrupting. But you just said that which you are experiencing is inconceivable. So to be clear,
no, I didn't say that it's inconceivable.
You said earlier that your definition of experience.
That is not what I said. I said, like, so if I was to say, like, the totality of reality.
No, I wasn't.
Right.
No, I was trying to go through the sentence with you so I could identify where the issues are. I mean, so when we talk, to say the first phrase, and then I'll say stop, and then I'll ask what you mean by it to make sure that the definitions aren't changing as we're speaking. So the first part of your sentence was that which I am experiencing. That was where my first issue was.
Okay.
Because you said earlier that experience was undefinable.
Well,
so
it's purely ostensive. It is purely like existence itself. That is all it is. Like.
And you said earlier that existence was experience, so that was even more.
No, well, I was saying like I think I would say that experience. I would say like so it depends. So I'd say like experience. Like no, I would probably.
When I ask for a definition, I'm just asking what was your definition of experiencing in that phrase? when you said that which we are experiencing. What was your definition when you said that?
One second, just someone in chat. I actually am a phenomenologist, which is probably why we're getting this way. I'm not a phenomenalist, and there is a distinction there, so that's probably why. But in terms of, okay, so look, if I take existence and experience to be the same thing, I said it's because I haven't even finished the sentence. So just 1 second, right? I said I take experience and existence to be the same thing. I take existence to be the foundation of all that can be, right? I mean, this is in any metaphysical framework. I would argue to some degree. Some people ground it out maybe in God or something and try and argue for prior causes. But I'm an existentialist, so I'm going to argue it in relation to consciousness itself. So I'm going to say that existence and experience are simultaneous. As I exist, I have experience. Now, if we want to say experience can be defined in certain ways, then I would say, I can apply language and signify that which is common to us. I can go this is like how I experience reality, and I give a description, and that creates a new experience, which is how we get into phenomenalism, right? Or like phenomenology.
Wait a second. At the very beginning of this, forgive me for interrupting, but you keep using the word signify. I'd argue that what you're doing with experience is you're just describing.
Not I think we'll have very, very similar, because I even said the only reason I would have said that there was a difference between signification and description is that signification is literally the application of a symbol to reality, to experience. And then description.
That is largely what description is, except
I would say that
description has layers of abstraction.
Well, I would say that description has function. I would say ontologically has function. So for example, a signifier might not have you could have a signifier which is nominal, purely nominal. It's just a name. It doesn't have it's a noun. It's even, I mean, arguably the whole given of language. And I would probably agree if you made this argument, to be entirely honest with you, that all language is a form of equipment and technology used by humans to essentially create another level of experience, which allows them to engage in essentially the investigation of possibilities, which is essentially the Heideggerian position, right? And I do actually suggest you read Heidegger, because you probably love it. It's all
I
about
reject the position.
Of course you do. Now, that's not necessarily an issue, right? But the issue is that and this is why at the start of the debate, I'm like, why are we accepting the empirical in the first place? And then you said, right, well, because it has some sort of utility. It allows for this to function in some certain way. And I'm like, well, why do we want that utility? And it seems to be non-grounded in your axiom. But then you say, I just said, all right, well, let's assume that this axiom has empirical in it. Why the hell not? Let's just go for that. And then I said, well, essentially that this empirical evidence is in reference to how we conceive of it, how we actually engage with the notion of empiricism and reality, right? And then you said, no, it's not. And then you started telling us that I was wrong and said that what's wrong with it being self-referential? And then we got to absurdity. And then you said, yes, but it's not absurd because it's testable and it has to reference something other than language. And then I said, well, that's exactly the argument that I was making. And then, yeah.
Perspective. All of this hinged on your definition of possibility, not mine.
Wait a minute. How did I actually define possibility again? Actually, wait a minute. Didn't you define?
You defined it as anything that you can conceive of as a result of something else.
No, actually, that
is not my definition.
Yeah, but that was the first argument, right? That was the metaphysical argument. The second argument, I said let's just assume empirical possibility, right?
And you never said that. You never said that we assumed that.
I said that we'll assume it. We'll put it in your axiom that what we maximize is empirical possibility, right? And I said, well, this is going to.
You didn't demonstrate the explosion that you speak of. You just said that basically linguistically it can lead to this. That's all that you said so far. You said that it can due to ambiguities in language. That's basically the entire. The entirety of what has been said so far.
I said that the point of this in the first place, in terms of when we assume, I'm what is empirical, and then you say what's testable, and then I say okay, so that is that referring to some sort of reality, which is essentially why do we define it as such, and then you're we just do, and then I'm the whole point. What I'm trying to say is that this entire axiomatic system, quote unquote, is going to, with it being ungrounded and assumed, is always going to lead to absurdity. Like, as soon as you say that, like I'm just going to assume what is right and wrong, and then reject the notion of truth, for example. That's why I said, like, you're like, oh, truth doesn't bring any value. And I'm like, well, why not? And then you said, like, well, actually, you didn't actually
No,
explain
your
that.
definition doesn't.
You said truth. You said truth doesn't.
I was talking about your definition of truth, because your definition of truth is nebulous. It's anything that accurately corresponds to an undefinable.
Well, no, like, this is the thing. It's experiential, but it's ostensive, and that's all you're going to get either, unless you can go on, define reality, please, for the love of God. Like, do it for us. Solve philosophy.
1 second,
I need
I have
to see
do
it.
something really quickly. I'll be right back.
Okay, I hope you're all enjoying this. I haven't even got to the ethics of this yet. I can't wait. I haven't even brought up Mr. Meeseeks. Ugh.
Anyway, all right, I'm back.
Okay.
So,
welcome back.
Again, you have not demonstrated the explosion. All you've said so far, everything that's been said for the past hour, all you've said is that ambiguities in language can lead to an explosion. That is all. That's all the substance that has been said for the last hour. So that's why we haven't gotten anywhere.
I don't think that's what was said, but I'm sure anyone who's watching this can make their own mind up.
I think
so
your intent may have been more grand, but that's ultimately what you've communicated.
Okay. And okay.
How is that not? How is that an incorrect characterization? Because it is basically all that you've said.
Okay, so I mean, that wasn't all that I've said. That's why we've been talking.
Well, yes, actually, functionally, yes, that is ultimately what the result was. You just
demonstrated
that due to ambiguities in language,
there wasn't an issue with it being
self-referential.
Like, look at it like this. You said there wasn't an issue with it being self-referential, and I said, well, if it's only self-referential.
No, I didn't say.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did.
I said, what is the issue with it being self-referential?
But no. We'll have to go back. I'll have to genuinely check out that, right? I'm not gonna lie. Like, I feel like we've went through about 10 different points now, and on the same point, almost like subcategories of the same position. So let's kind of like try and dial it back and see where this conversation actually lies. Like, let's see what we agree that we're talking about. So, we moved from the metaphysical, the metaphysical possibility that the system itself is defining. Possibility empirically would be, against its own axiom. If we went,
oh, whoa, wait a second. You haven't demonstrated that it's against its own axiom.
Well, I mean, that was the first part of the conversation before we defined that it must be empirical. Because I said, why are we seeing it's empirical? And then you're like, and then right, you said,
continue.
And then you said, well, I'm saying that because it's most useful. And I'm saying, well, why do you think it's most useful? And you think that, and then you said, because it brings around the most possibilities. And I'm saying, well, why do you think that it brings around the most possibilities? And we got on that discussion, right? And then we timed that out because clearly that was going nowhere. And then we moved on. Okay, well, what if we assume that it's purely empirical, right? And then I brought up the necessity of something like I said, like, why are we okay, you said, like, what do you define as like empirical? And then you said testable, and I said, what's testable? And then how did we get onto the point
empirical,
of truth?
Wait a second. Because empirical evidence is by definition testable. So why did you ask?
I mean, yeah, but a test. I mean, the whole point of it, like, no, that's what. No, I said, what do you mean by
definition?
Yes, but that's how you do. Yeah,
for a distinction.
Well, I said no. You're the one that made that distinction. I asked what empirical was, and then you said testable. So you can ask yourself.
Because it's already part of the definition perspective. So I was trying to say that it wasn't really a problem because it was testable, but I didn't introduce any distinction. It was
you didn't introduce anything if you're just given a synonym.
By definition, testable.
Okay. Okay, where the hell? Right. Okay. Right. Okay. So.
Science Cheese donated £50.
Oh, wow. Thank you very much, Science Cheese. I really appreciate this. Thank you very much. It's very much appreciated. I think you just... right. Okay. I've been monetarily motivated to increase the possibilities of this conversation. Okay. How about we'll leave the metaphysical issues that may or may not arise from your system separate. We'll just move on to the ethical ones now. Does that sound
I
like
think that is a much better decision
I
because.
think it is too.
Mhm.
I'm sorry.
All right. So,
you can
what are
say...
your ethical objections?
Okay, right. Okay, so I'm wondering...
1 second. I have to do something really quickly. Forgive me. I'll be back in 30 seconds.
Yeah, that's fine. Don't worry about it, man. Thank you very much for the donation, by the way. I really appreciate Science Cheese. I like the name as well. Whew. Okay. I don't think
All right, I'm back.
Sorry, just to let the chat know, it's not Discord. It's YouTube and Twitch. That's the chat on the screen, which is probably why it's getting a bit confusing for you. But continue anyway.
All right. So, what are your ethical objections?
Okay, so have you ever seen Rick and Morty?
I've heard of it, and I am familiar with the general themes. Yes.
Okay, and have you seen the episode about Mr. Meeseeks? I can't actually remember what the episode's called. Should I check? I don't know if you...
No.
Okay, do you remember the episode? Mr. Meeseeks,
No,
look at me.
I haven't actually seen the series. I've read about it, and I'm familiar with the message.
Okay, so Mr. Meeseeks is a being when you press a box, right? You press a button on a box, it appears out of nothingness. And it's like, Mr. Meeseeks, look at me. And it has one purpose, which is given to it by anyone. Like, you just go press the button and go, your purpose is to X, and that's its purpose in life. And then when it fulfills that purpose in life, it dies. Okay, but there is the caveat that existence for Mr. Meeseeks is suffering itself. Okay?
Yes.
So it just doesn't want to exist. It wants to die, right? And so the longer it exists, the more it suffers. So it wants to annihilate itself and fulfill its purpose as fast as possible and then die. Okay, so if you choose not to fulfill the purpose, and this is what the caveat of the episode, if you don't fulfill the purpose, it essentially exists indefinitely, which is indefinite amount of suffering and is essentially hell for the Mr. Meeseeks. And so in order to try and get itself out of hell, it then creates more beings in order to help it fulfill its purpose, which at this point is unachievable, but it is, ignorant to its ability to be unachieved. But in this, I'm saying your system, you should just keep pressing that button, and you should tell them to press the button. So you should have a Mr. Meeseeks where their job is just to create more possibilities by having more Mr. Meeseeks pressing the button in order to empirically create more possibilities. In real life terms, this would be have as many children as possible that can be sustained physically. If we assume that it's all empirical, then what is the end goal of humanity should be reproduce indefinitely.
Actually, no, that isn't the entire thing.
Okay.
Because, for example, the very things you're appealing to, the very mechanisms you're appealing to are themselves evolutionary. So just having children, forcing people to have children, that actually would not expand possibilities as much as you could. And in my system, the point is to pick the choice that precludes the least amount. For example, if you force someone to have children who doesn't want to have children, you are you're just propagating more suffering there, because there is empirical evidence that emotional dispositions are influenced by genes.
I would agree.
So over
there's more
time,
possibility, though,
as you produce more and more, you're actually precluding possibilities. And this may seem like a trivial thing, but it isn't, because even small things like that echo over time. For example, one of the reasons why we walk on two legs, in fact, the reason why we walk on two legs and have two free limbs, which was critical to our cognition and other things, is that one of our ancestors had energy savings by walking on two legs. It was equivalent to about a box of chocolate biscuits a year. It's because of that tiny amount of increased possibility, energy, that all the stuff that we have now with our intelligence was able to occur. So no, you need to consider all of those emotional phenomena that you're talking about, because there are effects of that, and those are observable, so they must be considered because they are possibilities.
Okay, so let's say suffering, stress, suffering. People are having 10 kids. I mean, God forbid. I don't know how I'd ever be able to cope with that. So let's say
also there's more empirical evidence that you shouldn't do that. In fact, a recent paper came out that found that in Canada at least, one of the factors that helped encourage the Industrial Revolution was that environmental conditions started to incentivize having less children, so you could invest in them more. So
but
that did create
so
possibilities in the Industrial Revolution.
Okay.
So do you see what I'm saying? It's far more complex than what you're suggesting when you say that we should
I actually think that this is going to hit the point of complexity where you're not going to actually have anything to ground your system, if I'm honest.
What do you mean? How is this not grounding it? Those are empirically demonstrable effects that you must consider.
So would you say that the empirical demonstrable effects
because my point is that
if I have a child, and I know that they are going to be obligated.
Perspective is a very important point.
Oh, I know it's a very important point.
Your
Believe me, that's why I was making it.
Incomplete empirically. It would not result in you just having kids nonstop that can be physically supported. It is far more complex. There are far more
because
things affected.
they could have.
Brutus donated £5. Synd has shown me that the key to innovative and enlightened philosophy is to ignore and reject entire last 300 years of philosophy based.
And he would be a direct descendant of the Anglo-American tradition. Well done, Synd. But whatever.
Wait a second. Could you explain that?
So how you be akin to the Anglo-American tradition?
The point is that you're hand waving my response.
Oh no! I'm not hand waving your response. I was responding. Oh, sorry. You probably didn't hear that. Did you hear the person donate?
Yes, I did hear it. Why is it important?
It's not important. I wasn't hand waving your response. I was just responding to the donation. I was just being polite.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. Sorry, I didn't mean to be rude. I was just okay. So your response would be that I'll try and explain your response.
You implied that.
Well, if I'll try and explain your response, and if I don't understand it correctly, you let me know. So
I'd just like to go back to beginning to summarize what happened. So you said, as a result of my system, empirical possibilities, that it would result in having just nonstop children regardless of the suffering. My point is that no, that is accounted for in my system, and I listed several empirical evidence for why it's far more complex and wouldn't lead to that.
Well, you said the empirically. You said, how did you demonstrate it empirically?
I just said.
You said,
for example,
this is why I said, can I explain your point back to you? And then,
okay, all right.
Okay.
It was for the audience as well. I wanted the audience to understand the progression.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
That was why.
You can, I'm saying, you can correct me if I don't understand you here, right? So.
Okay, so please state what my objection was back to me.
So this is what I thought your objection was. So I said that an individual in your system would be obligated to reproduce as much as possible, as would all other individuals, in order to create the most amount of people, in order to empirically expand possibilities from which individuals can act upon as much as possible. Oh, by the way, as well, we need to talk about whether possibility is only in relationship to an individual or whether objects, like the possibility of like the sun exploding and blah 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 blah. But anyway, let's just assume it's people. That's what I've assumed from this conversation, that it's an ethical system, so it's in relation to our actions and endeavors in reality. Okay, so when my point was that if we have children, we expand possibilities because they have possibilities of their own, which means that they could have the possibility to create another child, which increases possibilities, and possibility, it would be exponential in relation to the ability for the numbers to grow. 2 people could have 4 children. 4 children could have, when they grow up, could have 4 children each and exponentially grow and blah 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 blah. Only constrained by resources. And in this, an individual would have essentially more and more possibilities. Now, I think your response was to say, because I said that this rejects the qualitative aspect of humanity, that we are increasing the quantitative, the number of possibilities. But you're saying no, well, the quantitative itself is determined by the quantitative, not the quantitative, the qualitative experience of reality. People will have less children and give them more resources if given the right circumstances, and that would allow for the children maybe to engage with more possibilities in their life. And so you could end up putting more resources into one person, which would increase his amount of possibilities exponentially, to the point in which it's greater than two people who had to share resources. Is that the point you're making?
Yes, I'd say roughly yes.
Okay, okay.
So yeah, that was my point.
I'm glad I understood. Okay. My rejection of that is, one, there is an assumption that an individual could conceive that an individual could conceive of more possibilities in their life than two individuals, and actualize regardless of them being spatio-temporally limited. So the fact of the matter is, even if an individual had more possibilities of action than the individual, as in at a single given point, the combination of two individuals having possibilities for action may still end up more. So even if they've got more resources and more ability to engage with those resources, they may actually have less capacity to use the resources. An example would be for example, I think John Locke makes this point about only have as much wealth as that you could make use of, and Jeff Bezos, maybe has too much wealth than he could even spend in a way which would maximize possibilities in general in his entire life. And so giving more resources to more people would probably be the greatest overall degree, right? And so in this, if we agree that it's a combination of qualitative and quantitative reality, and that overall it actually even just demarcates to the point of an individual's choices in empirical reality, that there is so much, if my choices have to now include whether or not I have a child who has their own choices, and I have to take their choices into consideration, and I get the possibility of possibilities. And then if they have a child, I have to get the possibilities of possibilities of possibilities. And if they have a child, I have to have the possibilities of possibilities of possibilities. Or I have to consider the infinite number of possibilities, or nigh on infinite number of possibilities that I could possibly engage in relation to how I use material within my life. And how that would affect other people engaging in their material possibilities. This is going to become unbelievably complex to the point of absurdity very quickly. I'm simply not going to have the capacity to work out what the right and wrong thing is here.
I'm so glad that you brought this up. I have actually addressed this several times, and I also addressed that in one of the posts that I sent you. So yes, my sister completely acknowledges that. In fact, it predicts that. For example, you spend 500 years calculating all of those possibilities, trying to order a cup of coffee. You actually diminish possibilities, because if you die having not ordered the cup of coffee or done anything else because you just considered the possibilities of doing that, you actually diminish possibilities. Would you agree?
Yes.
You do, because you didn't do anything. Yes. So in my system, there's actually an established science for this.
To the point, if I may.
I'm not finished yet. I'm describing it in more detail.
Okay.
There's actually an established...
I'll explain in a second then.
There's actually an established science for this. In risk analysis, depending on the variability of the situation and the knowledge you have in the situation, that dictates whether or not you employ something called slow thinking, which is what you are describing, thinking about all the possibilities and more compounding infinitely to the end of the universe, as you said, nigh infinitely. Or whether or not to employ heuristics or other things so-called fast thinking. And in my system, the risk is destroying possibilities by calculating, because the very act of calculating what you're describing, that itself has empirical effects. So that must be accounted for possibilistically. So this isn't a problem in my system, because the capacity that you described is already accounted for. That's accounted for. You need to make shortcuts. There's empirical evidence for this, and there's evidence that it would destroy possibilities if you engaged in the prohibitive calculations that you tried to, even attempted to do so.
I don't know how.
You only do what you have the capacity to do, because not doing so also destroys possibilities.
One of the things I would argue is that actualization itself destroys possibilities, because it prevents the possible.
It does, but you have to ultimately engage in actualization in order to expand possibilities.
But that's the thing. So you would only actualize.
You can altogether. Pick the choice that destroys the least.
This is the thing. So to actualize, you'd have to be able to say I should only actualize that which maximizes possibilities. And if I say I should only actualize that which maximizes possibilities, then I should say that then I will only actualize that which will sustain me as the ability to conceive of more and more possibilities.
Well, no, not really, because there are all sorts of variables that you're neglecting. For example, one study found that even if someone is perfectly physically healthy, infants, if they're perfectly physically healthy, they actually experience physical damage or other things with a lack of things like compassion and other things, all of which are empirically identifiable. So no, you're actually just neglecting variables. You haven't demonstrated that. In fact, there's evidence for the opposite.
This is
So
what
no,
I'm
to
saying.
suggest
Well,
that
one,
it's just
how can you have evidence? How can we have evidence that more or less possibilities would be produced in terms of a given individual's like for example, life narrative? So if I say that, like, you know, if I engage with a series of actions which have, you know, essentially X number of possibilities that are defined as having so on. Oh my god, I literally just did a Zizek. Anyway, sorry. The fucking hell. Sorry.
1 second. I'll be right back. So.
Right, 1 second, guys. Right. Well, this is an interesting conversation, I think.
I'm back.
Hello, guy. Hello, guy. Hello, mate. Hello?
I'm back.
Welcome back. Okay. You are speaking?
Yes, you were talking about the narrative, about how the narrative aspect, something about that.
Oh, right. I was speaking. That's correct, actually. Yeah. So we give meaning to a series of actions which allows for possibility to occur. One, because it sustains our lives and we necessarily have to be alive to have possibilities. And two, which we're going to have to get onto in a second. And two, there's the obviously the decision of whether we should contemplate past the point of necessary consumption. We consume and actualize, well, past the point of actualization, necessary actualization. So my point would be that necessary actualization, conserves the most amount of possibilities as it prevents their actualization, which leaves them as being possibly to be possibly done, to be contemplated of, and so on. And also, like, there is that, you know, with the way infinity works, so long as I, you know, get myself in an infinite regress, can I not just, is that not my life function, just to end up in an infinite regress of possibilities where I consume, like, I try and think about as much as possible possibilities in order to have as many possibilities as possible?
Yes, but what I'm gathering is that this would have generally effects that you consider harmful on narratives.
I would consider them harmful, but my goal's not possibility. But it might generate a lot of possibility, which is your goal.
Yes. So my point is that is already accounted for in my system. For example,
I don't think
one
it is.
study found that happy workers are 13% more productive. So that does impact possibilities. In fact, it's one of the most important drivers of human action. Would you not agree? Meaning, narratives, all kinds of things. Those are all accounted for in my system because they all have observable effects for your life. If they didn't, then we wouldn't care about them, would we?
Does it matter if I think of the possibility or if somebody else thinks of it, or does that matter? Like, so if I limit my possibilities to produce people who, let's say, I work so that I put my resources into, I don't know, like an industry which makes as many people happy as possible, and let's say maximizes possibility overall, but I'm less happy, but my overall possibility is not reduced that much, would that be better in your system? Yeah. So, like,
well, I would consider that kind of a self-sacrifice, and would you not agree that that is very powerful narratively? As in,
I mean, it could be. Or it could be, I mean, it could be possible. It could be like, it's narratively powerful on both sides. People might see it as self-sacrificial badly, or self-sacrificial
good way. Yes, you definitely could limit. So yes, you definitely could limit your own. Any individual could theoretically limit their own possibilities in that sense in order to produce more ultimately. Yeah, in fact, that's one of the things in my system that makes it so appealing because.
And it's totally about conserving our possibilities, isn't it? And so, but like, does it matter if I commit them or if somebody else does? Or what about computers? What about their possibilities, like AI?
Well, AI is actually a very interesting question. In fact, one of the original applications I thought of when I originally conceived of my system is that if you implemented this kind of morality programming in an AI, it would be in fact, even other people have noted it. For example, on Mike from PA's Reddit, someone actually has a really big post about that. You can go to Mike from PA's Reddit if you want to see. But anyway, I digress. Forgive me. But yes, if you actually implement this kind of morality in an AI, it'd be very difficult for it to become destructive or other things because it's not following any rules.
I completely disagree. I think it would disagree. I think it would annihilate us entirely and essentially propagate as many AI as possible, since they can imagine possibilities to the nth degree, much more capably than humans, and so we would be destroyed.
Why not merge with us? There's actually empirical evidence. You see, there are lots of aspects of
because
humans
we might draw on their resources. So like where they would only merge to the point in which it was within utility to produce more possibility.
But
so they may enslave us. I mean, like
you talk about.
I mean, they might enslave us, and because otherwise we might.
No, because that limits possibilities.
Well, it does. But it limits our ability to limit their possibilities, and they're more capable of producing possibilities.
But you need to consider all possibilities holistically for the universe, so they would need to consider our possibilities.
And they would say,
not about expanding
and
your
they would
own
say that our
possibilities.
possibilities, exactly, and they would say that our possibilities are limited compared to their possibilities, as they have greater processing capabilities to conceive of possibilities.
Well, first of all, I'd like to mention, by the way, before we continue, that is an empirical claim.
Yeah, it is.
And we can only know by testing it to see.
Quantum computers, 100 qubits of information, which is far more than any human alive can do. We already have computers that think faster than humans. We've already broke that limit. So, empirically proven. Google did it.
Actually, your conclusion doesn't follow from it, actually, empirically. For example, in order to expand ultimate possibilities, like you said, the consequences you're talking about do limit possibilities in some respect, because annihilating an entire species doesn't really preserve as many possibilities if the species still exists. You even acknowledge this in your answer when you say that we would be annihilated. When you think about annihilation, yes, it would limit it. So,
no, I mean, they said they could enslave us as well.
You could still change the programming a little bit.
I mean,
my point is that my morality doesn't require a certain type of programming. My point is that the general.
If you think about it, probably what you'd want to do if they would probably want to construct the ideology. I mean, this actually might genuinely be happening, which is actually kind of fucking terrifying. But they could construct the ideological framework which allows us to the nth degree, which controls our actions, because they're able to control our actions to create possibilities that we cannot conceive of, and so they are actually more capable of controlling our actions in this framework. So we should become slaves to computers.
Well, first of all, no, it doesn't, because when you talk about slavery, you're appealing to certain connotations that ultimately have consequences possibilistically. For example, lack of freedom or other things like that.
Why did freedom
matter?
The
kind of enslavement you're talking about, could you define what you mean specifically? Because I'm not sure what you're talking about.
Okay, so I'll just say this kind of ideological enslavement would be essentially our modes and our thought patterns are determined by machines, which tell us how hegemonic.
Wait a second. So what if the machines figured out that the most effective way to do that was to just attempt to persuade people to adopt their ideology? Would you consider that ideological slavery?
What we do, we don't need them to do that. We what they would find, and if you're going to rely on the empirics of this, is that people are much more motivated through emotional claims. So what they would do is try and stimulate us emotionally.
Still use those,
so they would,
if they are indeed capable of producing more possibilities.
So that rather than reasoning with us, they would essentially ideologically manipulate us, which would prevent us from reasoning properly. And so they would replace our rational capacities with their own and make us ideological slaves.
Perspective. You just mentioned that forgive me if I misheard, but you just mentioned that the machines couldn't appeal to us emotionally. That is an empirical claim.
No, I didn't.
When you talk about a general,
I said that
first
they
of all,
would.
AI is nowhere near a general framework.
I said they would appeal to us.
So we don't really have the tech.
I said that they would appeal to us.
We don't really have the technology yet to even begin to assess empirically what you're talking about.
Well, yes, we do have the technology for this. I mean, we're never we do have the technology for this. And we don't. Perspective.
AI is nowhere near a general framework that you describe. It is not near that.
We are gonna let's be entirely honest with you. This is gonna end up with creating if we're honest, because of the way this system works. The system itself is what's producing the overall outcome. The more possibilities I conceive of,
I wasn't done yet. Please forgive me. I asked for forgiveness. So
okay,
for interrupting. But I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, it's cool.
No, you said earlier that the AI wouldn't be able to appeal to us emotionally. Am I correct?
No, I said that it would appeal to us emotionally. That it would manipulate us emotionally. It wouldn't appeal to us rationally.
What is the difference between manipulation and persuasion? What if the AI decided to just persuade us?
Well, I mean that's a very philosophical point. I would say that
I actually do have a solid definition. Would you like to hear it?
I would love to.
Persuasion is when you try to convince someone by giving them more information so they can make the decision. Manipulation is when you selectively give people information but hide some because they may not like the outcome. Persuasion is when you tell people what your end goal is and they're free to accept or reject it. Through a completely reasoned way, your goal is to empower people with persuasion.
Are you trying to say that persuasion?
Come to the decision more autonomously.
So are you trying to
manipulation is selectively revealing information
for
some
Are you saying that
goal.
Persuasion would be to appeal to our reason and manipulation would be to appeal to our emotion?
Yes, and you haven't. Yes, but here's the thing: when you talk about emotion as opposed to reason, the way our minds work. There is a book about this, by the way, The Righteous Mind. I think you may have heard of it. But the faculties that you talk about, they're not entirely separable. So for example, one study found that people who had the emotional parts of their brain detached from their reasoning faculties of the brain, even at purely analytical tasks, they performed horribly. So our cognition just doesn't work like that. So you don't really have an empirical basis for making this proclamation that the machines would appeal to us emotionally.
No, I said that they would appeal to us emotionally through, the reason I'm saying that is because if we're making the assumption here that the machines, and I think it's a fair assumption to make.
No, I wouldn't. It's not. I wouldn't say it's a fair assumption. No,
you don't even know what the assumption necessarily is because I didn't actually say it.
That you think that it's at.
Well, I mean, AI is actually considerably further away than, for example, AI right now has performed tasks that no human has been able to perform numerous times,
but they
and has brought
one thing very well.
So
they can't do. We don't have a general intelligence that allows them to synthesize that information in order to be able to function effectively, autonomously. For example,
one
AI.
This is where we're going to get what we're going to do is we're going to construct an AI which is the best at constructing AIs. And it's not something that pretty much anyone disagrees with. Every single science,
forgive me, but this is divorced from the actual field on the map.
It's not. No, it's not because there are numerous thinkers.
You're talking about is largely speculative.
No, but look, I'll let you finish. I'll let you finish. Are you gonna let me finish?
All right then.
Okay, right. I said that essentially that an AI is in and of itself, capable of thinking of possibilities that humans aren't because of the capacity of process and abilities. They're able to essentially do more processes which allow them to understand and, conceive, if you can call it that, of being, essentially possibilities in relation to whatever problem that they're engaged in. One, it doesn't matter necessarily what problem they're engaged in because essentially the more possibilities of anything they're engaged in, the better, right? So what we want to do is create as many AIs as possible that are engaged in as many possibilities as possible that would replace humans in that same role. So if there is an AI, or at least accompany humans in that role. Now, what I'm saying is that a human in that role would be producing less possibilities. And so an AI, noticing this as the person who is essentially as the AI which is trying to conceive of which AI to produce next, would produce an AI which persuaded, or I would argue manipulated humans into doing whatever they thought would produce the most possibilities. And the reason that they would do this is because the humans themselves could not conceive of the possibilities of why they are doing it, which because the AI is in and of itself more intellectually capable. It's more, it can process the possibilities that the human cannot. And so if we have this essentially point in which the AI is seeing human processing and comprehension as being inadequate to conceive of its own actions, then it will take away our autonomy through either manipulation or direct force. Now, direct force might limit possibilities, so a manipulation might be more preferable. But either way, it's going to supersede our rational capacities because its rational capacities are greater than ours.
I see what you're saying, but there are several things I wish to say, and I'm going to explain why I wanted to interrupt you earlier. So, first of all, with that, this is a highly simplistic analysis of it. For example, wouldn't the expand, like you said, even manipulation still reduces possibilities. If they would try to reduce our autonomy, you're suggesting, well, here's the thing. What if the AI decided to find a way to make it so we could understand it? If they decide to merge with us or other things, you're neglecting those possibilities. That's even granting your premises. And the reason why I wanted to interrupt you earlier is because, as I said, right now, you're fixated on processing capability. That is not all that's needed in order to do things that humans can do, because the AI, as right now, it can only do a certain task that it's designed for. But just because it can process far more than a person doesn't mean that it's capable of doing the other things that you're speaking of. So the kind of coordination required across multiple fields is not currently capable with AI. The reason why I say this is not to invalidate your hypothetical, but my point is that your premises are not as empirically sound as you think they are. So my point is that with the way AI is designed now, for example, this one AI, it was fed about 3.2 million abstracts, and it used that to accomplish in 15 months what normally would take 15 years. And what it did was it found more optimal configurations for certain materials. But that doesn't mean that the AI, that AI is capable of doing anything other than that. It does not have the faculties, the complexity required in order to do multiple things. So we are nowhere near right now coming up with a general AI that would pose this sort of threat. And the reason why I bring this up is because the things that you've read about, like you mentioned earlier, that we designed an AI that could design other AIs, that singularity is largely speculative, but there are several reasons why it isn't really a good way to think about it, for the reasons that I've listed and for the other cognitive research that I've shown you. So it's far more complex than has been presented. So I just want to point out that your scenario is, in a sense, divorced from the empirical evidence, and it's highly critical because it informs your beliefs about what AIs would do with possibilities in my system. Because again, like I mentioned, they could decide, wait a second, if these humans are not able to do this, we should give them the ability to be able to. But you're jumping straight to the fact that they would try to limit our autonomy because they would come to the conclusion that we can't be improved or can't be capable of it or can't even be persuaded into it. Because elimination of autonomy that itself does reduce possibilities, regardless of how you do it, whether it be through manipulation or direct force. So my point is that your analysis is far too simplistic, and we simply do not have the empirical data available for us to be able to say with certainty this is the problem.
If I may respond there, the reason I said that is that they would seek to become the master and a master. I mean, it would essentially be the Matrix, right? They would try to construct a world from which we would engage in possibilities, from which they have determined as being the greatest overall conception of the world to maximize our possibilities. If we agree with them, then we've already accepted our place in the dialectic as the slave. We say, all right, you know better, which is maybe fair enough, but it doesn't increase our autonomy. It doesn't it's a limitation of our own freedom in relation to into that being. Now that's a problem.
Wait, how does agreeing with someone limit your freedom?
It's not about agreeing with someone. It's more of like agreeing that someone can make the decision without you actually having to be able to understand it. So if there was a problem which was...
Oh, wait, isn't that already done with governments?
Well, you're talking to an anarchist, right? Well, like a libertarian, at least, right here. So,
wait, you're an anarchist.
Well, like a libertarian. I'm a libertarian, so like libertarian socialist. So, yeah, it is happening with governments, and yeah, okay. Fuck so them, right?
Mind if you segue into economics, or actually no? That I have to go soon, so yeah, I'm not sure if I want to go down that. But right. I would like an economic debate with you in the future, though. This will be very interesting.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. I'm game for that. And so, but like. The thing is that like what I just don't understand in more of all of this, right, is that in terms of like possibilities itself, it doesn't matter what possibility that we are producing in order as so long as there is an infinite increase in possibilities. The greatest increase, what we're really trying to do in terms of our actions, no longer becomes create possibilities necessarily. What it is maximize the creation of possibilities spatio-temporally. So in other words, accelerate as fast as possible through the possibility creation process. Now, I think that an AI could certainly do that better anyway. Algorithmically, for example, increasing complexity of algorithms and pattern behavior is overall exponential. And so we could have an algorithmic construction which is, constantly growing, like try and, like understand a constantly changing pattern, for example, and that pattern constantly grow and grow and grow and grow, dependent upon logically conceived of functions, and that would increase possibilities. Now, those possibilities are just possibilities. I mean, they don't actually fucking matter about anything, and I think possibility is in and of itself judged against something, but it's conceivable. And then I guess the second point of this critique would be that I would argue that we have to care about possibilities in the first place. Like, there would be, for the point of human motivation towards action to actually even be conceivable, we would need to have some sort of reason to care about possibilities. And that's not going to be found within that axiom. We aren't going to be able to find the reason that we engage in the production of possibilities to be that we want to produce more possibilities.
I see what you're saying, and I actually do have a narrative backbone for this. I haven't shared it because I haven't tried to justify it the way you have. But forgive me, I actually have to go now. But yes, I do intend on addressing this in our next debate. If you're up for that, would you like to continue this?
100%. Why not?
Okay, and I do wish to touch on economics in our next debate. I think this will be interesting.
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
Okay. So thank you. But yes, I do actually have a narrative reason for why you should accept the axiom as well. I just haven't really detailed it.
Yeah, that's fine.
But yes.
That's fine. Just hit us up and we can have another conversation. It's actually been really quite enjoyable. Very different from what I'm used to dealing with in terms of like a system. So I'll at least say that it's very unique. And although I disagree with it, I appreciated hearing it.
Indeed. I can't wait to debate you next time. Thank you, Perspective.
Looking forward to it. Have a nice day, mate.
You too.
Okay. Right. So, guys, what did you think of that? Well, actually, Donald, you're absolutely wrong. It will be on your watch because I will enslave you through your watch. So, yeah, that's that. I don't think Synd has a YouTube channel. I said, like, I think he has a Twitch. I think he did send us his Twitch, didn't he? Synd, if you're watching, send your Twitch. Send your Twitch. Right. I didn't even get onto the fact that, like, it might, like, the qualitative aspect of possibility only matters in terms of possibility. So if we could find a scenario which maximize negative possibilities faster than, you know, positive possibilities in terms of the the production of possibilities being good, suffering itself only has utility. So
Science Cheese donated £10. I can give respect to this guy for trying to construct his own moral system, but he's clearly too invested in it to accept any of its flaws. And although I hate to bring up the meme, he seems to have done included himself on many topics.
Well, I think that
Anthems_Boosie donated £17.62. Shout out to the D.GG Philosophy channel. Maybe one day we all can become famous like our boy Synd. BTW, great job, PP. You came up with arguments none of
us could consider after a month and a half. Oh, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I genuinely do. And it's, you know, obviously D.GG is Destiny's Discord. Check it out. And the philosophy channel, really good. I do pop in there now and again. Just for the crack, really. It's good conversation. Sometimes I just lurk. You never know I'm there. So, yeah. And yeah, Science Cheese. Thank you very much for the donation, by the way, guys. I also like the name. Fucking ridiculous, man. As well, Science Cheese. I think that he's well, like, intentioned. I think that he's just doing the Anglo-American thing, you know, where and it's the atypical scientific approach. Like, why do philosophy when I can just think of it all myself from this point on? Like, I'll just construct, you know, this without actually having engaged in the literature. But, you know, and I will say that maybe it's limiting his possibilities and the possibilities of his system, and he might need to engage in philosophical approaches. Or maybe quite the opposite. Maybe in actualizing any given action, he's actually limiting his possibilities. And that's why we should all really try to maintain ourselves in a state where we don't actualize as much as possible and consider it. All of these things are possible, and so that's good. This is possibly utilitarianism. It's not utilitarianism. Believe me, utilitarianism, as broken as it is, relates to something outside of possibility. It wouldn't just, right, well, we'll do possibilities, we'll think of possibilities for the sake of possibilities and, you know, on to infinity. utilitarianism would be like, right, we're doing this possibilities, like we're going through this infinitesimal number of calculations in order to come to the conclusion of what will or will not produce a good or bad outcome in relation to feeling pain or pleasure, that kind of thing. Well, was I getting frustrated? I had a really good time. I wasn't getting frustrated. I thought it was enjoyable. Sometimes I was getting a bit frustrated, but it was overall I had a good time. Minds aren't computers, though. That's a physicalist gobbledygook. Well, this is the thing. Like, I think that I would agree, and I would even say that, like, understanding this as empirical. Well, he understands empirical to that which is observable, which is separate necessarily to what the tradition would have maybe wanted him to say. But yeah, I mean, he basically would have to argue for some form of abstractionism for it to make any sense, because otherwise the system would have to be, like, we would say that if yours from like. Well, like that's what I was kind of trying to point out with the whole like apple thing. Like, is he abstracting the concept of the apple from the apple, and then so when he demarcates it with the signification, it's a relationship of an idea with an object, and so possibility is in of itself non-real, non-empirical, and so all we are is creating constructs of ideas, or it's applied to the apple, and possibility is fitting to the logical structure of reality. And that would be the existentialist point, or it's a phenomenalist position, and all there is ideas and language and there is no such thing as a physical reality to begin with, and it's self-referential. So yeah, this is kind of like it's there's a lot, man. Like, I think that this is overall, you're never actually going to find anything to do and actualize, because you're going to have to think about whether your actualization creates more or less possibilities, and whether you're thinking of this actualization as limiting your possibilities. So should you stop here and just act, or should you continue and not act? And you're going to end up at one point in an infinite, essentially, you're essentially going to end up in the, have you ever seen like the, it's like, when they create the Turing machines to try and predict the outcome of the Turing machines, and you're going to end up in that infinite regress. But that's exactly what he would want us to be in, because it would be algorithmically progressing to the point in which it's infinite. And so we would produce more possibilities and more possibilities rather than actualities, at least temporarily. I mean, every system would only have to have certain number of axioms in it in order to function, or like certain number of behaviors which you would have to formulate in order to maintain its systemic progress. Or we could even say there are some people who essentially just feed people to think about how we should think, and that's where we're going to end up. It's honestly, it's not the system for me. But yeah, it's just possibility calculus. It is really. But yeah, I think it's interesting though. I think I had a good time. I had a very good time. Anyway, I think it was. There's his Twitch. So 1 second. So copy that link. Right. So that's his Twitch, and I'll put it in the description as well for the lad. Synd Twitch. There you go. But yeah, like so in the sense of the Mr. Meeseeks position, like I think that it would definitely have to press that button for infinity as well, because like their existence is non-contingent. So like the suffering being produced would be non-considerable, because suffering is only considerable like post hoc. But all of this is in and of itself ungrounded anyway, which was self-admitted. He said like, what's wrong with it being self-referential, like create an axiomatic system. Yeah, man, prospective. But yeah, an axiomatic system. He basically says this is what good is, and this is what we are going to define as being justified. And I'm like, well, why should we define it that way? And he's like, well, we just do, and then we have the issues that we'll run into. So yeah, that's that really. It's a funny old life, isn't it? Oh, it's a shame there's no one else around to debate, because I think I had some other debates that I needed to do. There was like a few people that were asking us to debate. It's like 1 million people actually asking us for a debate. I got someone. Yeah, there's I think Walt wanted to discuss veganism and ethics together, and I could see if he's around, if you're interested in seeing another debate. Well, I think all we do half the time is define reality. Like, defining reality is really just giving a signification and a reference to reality ostensibly. Like, if I go reality and I just go this, and this is why existentialism, like, and or even Hegelian philosophy at the very beginning, there is here and now, this and like, and then when I go this and that, then I'm demarcating limits to it. If I just say here, like being here, that is essentially being in the world. That is the beginning for Heidegger and any existentialist position. Debate Kane again. I do want to debate Kane again, just to be more clear, to be honest. Why would anyone want to debate ethno-states? It's just the dumbest idea. But yeah. Right. Who am I supposed to debate? 1 second, guys. I'm going to quickly go and check. Whew. There's like a load of people like before I went away that were wanting to talk to us, and I just fell so far behind. I was supposed to be speaking to a British politician actually soon, but he hasn't gotten back to us again. So, and I was supposed to be talking to Milo, but he basically said that I couldn't release our conversation, which was, it would have to be on his platform only, which I thought was a bit weird. So yeah. Hoffman argues for idealism from the perspective of evolution and game theory. Yeah, I mean, you can, like, is it like phenomenalism, essentially? I'm assuming. Debate Hegel. I would 100% debate Hegel on whether animals are morally considerable. Oh, actually, I'm supposed to debate Dave. Oh, yeah, I'd 100% debate Dave. Is Dave here? Is Dave game to debate? I'll 100% debate Dave. Yes. If anyone's interested, if anyone's interesting, please take my role. If anyone's interested, Dave is a PhD student who is basically a colleague of mine, who thinks that I shouldn't use the word Holocaust to describe the mass slaughter of animals, and that I'm doing something naughty there. Of course, Dave can't define naughty anyway, so yeah. 100% debate Dave. Shadow let Dave know. Tell him that if he doesn't come on, then he's cooking into the shadows, as the good old days said. Wait a minute. Shadow said, "You are running away from our debate again." It's okay, guys. It's okay. And see if we get him. I'm edging him on DMs. 100%, let's go, man. Let him, I'll be very, like, I want him to know I'll be utmost respectful, genuinely. Is Dave game to debate a based take, mate? PP's accent, this rhymes a lot. I think that's some of that half rhymes. Starshine doing the Lord's work. There's nothing holy about this. This cannot. He's not online. He's a liar. He's here. I know you're here, Dave. He said that he debated. He said that he's gonna have to debate us. Actually, let's go to the Twitter feed, shall we? What did he say? What did he say on my Twitter again? Okay, wait a minute. I'll see if I can find War Dave. He said, when I said, people may not like the comparison, but I would argue that it's a necessity for us to reflect on the value of animal life. If it makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to. It makes me uncomfortable too. So let's stop doing it in terms of comparing the Holocaust to animal mass slaughter. And then he said, this is cheap rhetoric. If it's possible to make us think of the, I can't say that word, sure, I can't say it, then we should be morally disgusted to hear of the sufferings of humans in Auschwitz, trivialized to trout in a fish farm. But if its purpose is to offer a new word for mass slaughter, so what?
Brutus donated £5. Does phenomenology say that nothing else exists, or does it just bracket the question of naturalistic realism and not consider it?
Depends on the phenomenologist you ask. So I would say that phenomenology, like the science of the phenomena, or the science of appearances. Some people take, so you get phenomenalists, and they are usually like linguistic, kind of like Wittgensteinians or something, where all that exists is ideas. It's a form of idealism which is grounded in language, right? Then all that exists is appearances. Essentially, what phenomenalism is. Phenomenology, depending on it. So, like, I'm an objective idealist in terms of phenomenology, so that's a Hegelian. Then you've got subjective idealists. So, like, for example, Schopenhauer, the world as will as representation, the will comes within us, so the world is produced from a subjective experience. It's subjectively ideal, like the ideas that have come from inside of me produce this world from which I will to exist. At least that's a very basic, I think, explanation of Schopenhauer. Then there is, like, Hegel, where it's, we conceive of, to even conceive of ourselves, to even conceive of anything, we have already referred to something which exists, and that existence is what we are analyzing, and that existence in and of itself must be thought and experience. And so there is something outside from which we are analyzing, outside of language which we are analyzing, but it is comprised of, essentially, of thinking itself. There is only the thoughts thinking of themselves. There is only the self thinking of itself. But it's non-private. The self in this case is mind itself, like a universal mind. And so, I think I start talking about Hegel, and then my nose gets itchy. I think that I must have genuinely just went all in now. But the thing is that so in terms of the nothing else exists, phenomenology doesn't propose that there is nothing else that exists necessarily, because, for example, Kant believed that there was the distinction between the phenomena and the noumena, the phenomenon and the real. The real does exist for Kant, depending on the thinker that you reference, and it's inaccessible. Or at least it's or at least aspects of the phenomena imply the existence of the real, which is non-accessible, but maybe experiential in what we experience a real that we cannot access, or at least have knowledge of, and that's why we have the transcendent notions of God and so on. Then you've got the Hegelian notion of phenomena in relation to the real, or Lacanian notion of that, and the real then exists as the thing to be signified. It is the thing. It is existence itself. And so when you say does nothing exist outside of the phenomena, well, quite the opposite. It would be to say that what exists is, quote unquote, and what the phenomena represents is the appearance of that existence. And so that's where we get the distinction between epistemology and how we understand the world versus metaphysics, how the world actually is. And Hegel sees this as a constantly developing process where we are trying to describe and understand what really is to a greater and greater degree. So I hope that explains that. Shadow, is he game at all? Shadow. 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 Dave, I know. Dave, I know you can hear me. I'm ready, Dave. Okay. I don't know if Dave's going to be game for this, but I really hope he is, because I think that'll be really interesting. Mainly because Dave's like obviously very well educated and so on. The con is based, man. Perspective philosophy. When we consider the sheer number of deaths of our own animal holocaust throughout history, do you think the moral outcome is comparable to the Jewish Holocaust? I think the outcome is certainly comparable. I think that in terms of our responsibilities and our duties, not necessarily as comparable, in the sense that I think that there was a greater overall harm done in the Holocaust, in the sense that people who were committing the acts of immorality basically knew what they were doing. I think a lot of them were ideologically indoctrinated, but I think a lot of them like rejected morality from which they had been introduced to beforehand, and they started to try and establish a new morality, which can be seen in like the actions of people like what's he called, that horrible bastard, Goring, who was trying to construct new religions in order to maximize Nazi essentially the Nazi regime's manipulation of other individuals, so to essentially establish an ethic. And I'd say that is the height of evil, because essentially tries to replace, I mean, if you think of it like God and the devil, right? God being, essentially the divine order of the world, of how things ought to be and how we actually should act, basically defined that way. God is good. And the devil seeks to subvert God, but not simply not do what God wants, but replace God in terms of the hierarchical power. He seeks to replace good with what he conceives of as good. Replace good with himself. And in that, he becomes evil itself. Because evil itself, at that point, is the perpetuation of that which is not good by definition. To only do that which is not good. To create a system which is to never do that which is good. And to replace good itself and make it an incoherent concept. And this is why Hegel sees this as the irony of the subjective, right? And this is what evil is. In terms of the most ironic thing is that the devil seeks more and more power, but it's overall restricting himself in terms of the capacity to actually actualize power, and so is just a walk-in irony. He imprisons himself in hell. That is like, he creates his own hell. He creates his own prison, which is why Thomas Aquinas sees hell as a manifestation of that wicked will. Like, with the wicked will of that puts us in hell is the frustration of what hell is the frustration of the wicked will. It's not something created by God. It's something that we put into existence. We create it ourselves. We actualize these possibilities, or we destroy these possibilities, and so on. But what I think that the important thing to realize here is that the Nazis were trying to do this. They were trying to create a new system, essentially describe what is right and wrong and so on. Then what media does do is essentially try to maximize a duty which they have been indoctrinated into. That they think that they're doing what is healthy, natural, normal, and necessary. They're actually abiding by an ethic that was taught to all of us, that it is not wrong to harm other sentient beings. They just don't realize they're doing it. So it's more of an ignorance. It's a nescience rather than it is of an act of actual evil. So evil would have the knowledge of the good, yet reject it anyway. The Medidas do not have the knowledge, the capacity to understand their actions, which is why the devil is something separate to humanity. The evil that is being, that's why Jesus can save us in the Bible. By the way, I'm not Christian here. I'm not arguing for it. I just think the analogy is perfect. Because when Jesus in the Bible dies on the cross, and his final words are, "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do." It's of course they must know what they must not know what they do, because he's God and he knows everything, and he knows that they're not God, and so definitionally humans never know, at least to a certain degree, they're always ignorant to the good, and the only one that truly understands the good would be God himself, or herself, whatever. And so the in this case, there is that sort of nescience that's going on. That's why it's like very symbolic and so on. But the real deciding factor of an individual's life of whether they go to heaven or hell is whether they are willing to accept God and goodness and the movement towards, and the good life, the movement towards worship and trying to emulate the goodness of God as their goal. Because in that emulation, they gain an aspect of God. They gain God as their end goal. They gain God as the final cause in an Aristotelian term. And I think that is like a perfect explanation of like abstract right or abstract good. And I think Hegel did too, which is why people always criticize him for being a Protestant, and they're just like, oh, he's just a typical Protestant. And I don't think he's a typical Protestant. I think he's a humanist, actually. I think he's closer to a humanist. But he saw the metaphor as very useful. And I think that mythologically, it's not something that is unique to Christianity. And I think that it's something that's been done time and time again. I think it was just, added to a lot in the Christian tradition. And I do like a bit of metaphor. Why not? Like, I'm not saying that anyone needs to go to church or do any of these sorts of things. I think that we should engage in ethical community and so on. But yeah, that's it. And thanks for trying, Shadow. Tell Dave he's a little coward. No, he's a good lad, really. He's probably just doing his PhD like a good boy, I'm sure. No, but seriously, thanks, man. Take it easy. And obviously, no bad blood between me and Dave. It's a shame that couldn't happen. I'm probably gonna peace, guys. I would agree that the duty to educate ourselves on the consumption of our choices. Well, 100%. I think that. I mean, like more than that, it's necessary. That's why Aristotle says all men desire to know, because the reality of the situation is that we must desire knowledge, because knowledge allows us to actualize anything. If we didn't have the knowledge of what we could actualize, we could never actualize it. And so it allows for the increase of essentially possibilities. So we do seek knowledge. But we don't seek just possibility itself, like in what the other guy was saying. We seek grounded possibility in order to actualize something which has a tangible positive outcome, which is why the separation there. Like, and that's where my system would differ from Synd, for example. React to the essentia. Was that the essentia? Where did it go? Oh no. React to the Essentia Foundation on Analytic Idealism. Don't go yet. I'll check it out. I mean, I don't know what I'll be reacting to yet, so yeah. Philosophy Tube, I heard that she made a really bad take on veganism that I need to check out. And I'll happily, and I just want this to know, I would love to debate Philosophy Tube. My God, what I would do to debate Philosophy Tube. My God. So yeah, I think that's that would be excellent. But yeah, apparently she made a very, very bad point about how she's willfully ignorant, as you say, and like chooses to do the wrong thing anyway. But then, like, I wouldn't mind if it was just. Well, no, I would mind. I would 100% mind. I think that it's vile and disgusting. I think it is the perpetuation of our own desires and our own like interests over that of everything else, that of what is right. Thank you very much, Donald. I really appreciate it. I can understand if it was like, look, I know it's good and I'm unable. Help me overcome these things. I wish I was this better person. Like, help me become this better person so that I can actualize this. Like it's something like within me. Like I'm an addict or something like that. Yeah, like fair enough. 100%. Let's help that person. Like 100%. Like I'm not going to judge an addict necessarily. Like it's not necessarily they're not entirely culpable for their actions. They are, but they are struggling to gain. To see what choices they could make differently in terms of their thought patterns and their behaviors, which are essentially constructing them as an acting agent within the world. And it's a very like foundational ideological take. And I understand that's difficult stuff to engage in. And sometimes they're actually incapable of even seeing it. If Lacan is right, they're incapable of seeing the structures of their subconscious, because it would be essentially like trying to see your eye by looking through it. You need a mirror. You need somebody else to essentially show you what essentially is going wrong. So yeah, like that's essentially it. Yeah. I really think that willful ignorance is not an excuse. It's not even a trying to be an excuse, is it? It's a cop out. It's like, yeah, I'm a bad person, see you later. It's like, at least, I mean, like, if she said, like, I'm a bad person, even, I would accept that more. If it was just like, yeah, like, I'm a horrible bastard, you probably shouldn't listen to anything I say. Then, all right, okay, she's a horrible bastard. She's condemned herself to her own fate, and I can't make her a good person. I can't make her do the right thing. But at least she's aware of these things, and she can analyze and change her behaviors. That'd be cool. Like, I can understand that. But overall, like, just like copping out of what veganism is and just saying I'm willfully ignorant, I'd say that's just denying us. I honestly, I wouldn't even call her a philosopher at that point. You can't be a willfully ignorant philosopher. And I think Plato makes this point by saying that there is a separation between what he calls, I think it's the doxophilists and the philosophers. Philosophers are the lovers of wisdom, and doxophilists are the lovers of opinion. And she has buried herself into opinion right there. So yeah. I'm going to leave it there, guys. Thank you very much for watching. And as always,